So Luke chapter 15 and verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering round to hear him. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. And then moving on to verse 11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him.' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' The son came home, the father welcomed him back, and they all lived happily ever after." That's basically how this story seems to be ending, isn't it? It seems like Jesus is winding down, and verse 24 seems like it's the perfect ending. You can imagine if this story was a movie, the camera would pan out from the dinner table, everybody'd be laughing, they'd be smiling, the music would start, the credits would begin to roll. It would be a perfect ending. And yet, Jesus doesn't finish where we expect him to finish. He takes what seems to be a perfect finale and he smashes it before our eyes. Just as we reach the point in the story where we have a lovely warm feeling inside, Jesus takes it away. He gives us the chills instead. And so the question that we want to ask this morning, why does Jesus seemingly ruin a perfectly good story? Why doesn't Jesus finish with verse 24, where everything is neatly tied up? Well, the answer is there is something about this older son that we desperately need to hear. And so this morning, what I want us to do is to focus in on this final scene. Now, before we do that, let me ask you, do you remember what our theme was last week? We thought about the younger son, and we thought about how you can sum his life up in 2 words: rebellion and ruin. Well, if you look at the older son, he looks completely different. And yet, if you were to scratch underneath the surface, you would see that there is something equally as tragic. And the 2 words that sum up the older son, it's not rebellion and ruin, but it's religion and ruin. And it's very, very important that we understand that, and that's why Jesus finishes this story in the way that he does. So let's come and look at this final scene. Let's think about this older son. Now, I wonder, when we read this story, did you feel sorry for the older son? I mean, the younger son, he's been out having the time of his life. He's been drinking, he's been dancing, he's been taking the father's hard-earned money and he's been pouring it down the drain. But what about the older son? He's been working. He's been getting his hands dirty. He's been doing as he's told. And really, that sums this guy up. He was a model worker. He's the sort of guy who's always on time, never takes a sick day, never does sloppy work. He's someone that the father can trust 100%. The father knows he's going to get the job done. Really, he couldn't be more different from his ungrateful swine of a younger brother. The younger brother threw everything back in the father's face. The older brother is completely different. And yet, when the father throws a party for one of his sons, who's it for? Not for the guy who's been working hard, but for the son whose life has been an absolute disaster. And so, of course, it's easy for us to feel sorry for this older brother. It's easy for us to imagine how he might have felt whenever he walked in from another long, hard shift in the field. It's easy for us to imagine how he would have felt when he heard the music. It's easy to imagine the anger and the indignation whenever he heard about who had come home. His reaction seems to be perfectly natural. I think if I had worked as hard as he had, or if you had worked as hard as he had, and if you had never been given a party, but the younger son is, we'd be every bit as upset, wouldn't we? In verse 28, we read that this older son was angry. We read that he wouldn't go into the party, and there's something inside us that wants to leap up and jump to his defence. But before we do, we need to remember what the point of this story is. Jesus is teaching us about what God is like. And he's teaching us that when God shows his grace, there is a right way and a wrong way to respond to that grace. And so we need to see the older son through that lens. And if we're really going to get to the bottom of things, we need to see verse 1 to verse 3. That's why we read that at the start of our reading. Verse 1. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. Do you remember a few weeks ago we thought about the tax collectors, and we thought about what they were like? They were basically gangsters. They were exploiting people, they were making people's lives a complete and utter misery. They were the scum of the earth. And here's Jesus, and what's he doing? He's openly speaking to people like that, the lowest of the low. And so it's no surprise in verse 2 that the Pharisees and all the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." And so then in verse 3 we're told, then Jesus told them this parable. And that word then is very significant because it tells us what Jesus says next is a response to what the Pharisees have been saying. So Jesus tells this parable. It's actually 3 parables in this chapter. There's the lost sheep, there's the lost coin, and then there's the lost son. But this parable is part of Jesus' response to what the Pharisees are saying. And when you realise that, it's not hard to understand what this story is actually about. Who is the prodigal son? Well, he's a picture, isn't he, of these sinners that Jesus is spending time with. People who have made a complete disaster of their lives. People who are about as far away from God as you can possibly imagine. And Jesus is showing us even people like these, the lowest of the low, even people like these are not lost causes. Even people like these can experience God's incredible restoration. Even people like these can know grace when they repent. And here's the thing, if these tax collectors, these so-called sinners, are the younger son, and if God, of course, is the father, well then, who's the older son supposed to be? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? He's the Pharisees. Good people, decent people, upright people. Religious people who knew their Bibles inside out. People who never missed a church service. Dare I say it? People who are very much like some of you who are watching this morning. And the message that Jesus is telling us is really clear. And maybe it's a message that some of you desperately need to hear this morning. Religion can lead to ruin. Religion can lead to ruin. It's a dramatic message, isn't it? And as we look at this story, you can see how the older son is a really good picture of the Pharisees. They are both exceptionally hard-working. They both live disciplined, frugal lives. They're both absolutely committed to doing the right thing. You can imagine that both the Pharisees and this older son would have had very similar reputations. Maybe you can imagine, let's say the father goes to market, and as soon as he turns his back, the whispers start, and people are talking about that younger son, that guy who took all the money and cleared off and just left the father hanging. And you can imagine the sorts of things they'd say, but you can also imagine they never had a bad word to say about the older son, because he was completely different. He's beyond reproach. And the Pharisees, well, they were just like that, completely beyond reproach. They were the most meticulous, most religious, most committed people you could possibly imagine. And of course, that's a good thing. It's good that this son was hardworking. It's good that he was reliable. It's good that the Pharisees were committed to God's word. But there's a sting in the tail, isn't there? Because as well as showing us a picture of religion in this son, Jesus also shows us a picture of ruin. And the picture that Jesus paints for us, it's not pretty. Notice the son is angry in verse 28. Notice especially the sharpness in his voice in verse 29. You can almost imagine the contempt that is dripping from his tongue as he speaks. Notice how defensive he is. I've never disobeyed your orders. Emotionally, this son's in a very bad place. He can't enjoy the music. He can't enjoy the food. He can't sit back and have a night off. There is something inside him, and it's eating him up. Just think of all the negative character traits that we see in this older son. He's resentful. He can't stand the idea of his brother being back. Everybody else is overjoyed. Everybody else is just thrilled for the father. But this son is sick to the stomach. He's judgmental. Notice how he describes this younger son. Not my brother, but this son of yours. He makes it abundantly clear that even if the father welcomes the son back, that's something he is never going to do. He's ungrateful. Verse 29. All these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. That's such an unfair accusation, isn't it? We know what the Father is like. We know that he is loving. We know that he's generous and compassionate. We know that he gives abundantly to his sons. And yet the only thing that this guy is able to focus on isn't what he's been given. It's what he hasn't been given. He's ungrateful. And this narrative that he constructs entirely within his own head, it's eating him up. It's ruining him. And maybe most of all, under the surface, this son is frightened. He's frightened that if the father has welcomed his brother home, then that means less for him. He's frightened that if the younger son is back in the good books, then he's going to lose his special place. He's terrified that all of his hard work, all of his sweat and tears over the years might not be worth as much as he thought they were. He's frightened. He's ungrateful. He's judgmental. He's resentful. And okay, he's not in a pigsty, but he's ruined, isn't he? It's just that he's ruined in a different way. And I wonder how many religious people are just like this. Outwardly, they have everything all together. Their kids are well turned out. Their jobs are respectable. They're well thought of in the community. And yet they're judgmental and resentful and frightened. Well, that was certainly the case with the Pharisees. And let's be honest, if you were to look at an average church in Ireland, you're going to find people just like that. People who have been ruined by religion. And I have to ask, how many of you watching this right now have been ruined by religion? Jesus is telling us it's a very real danger. So what's the lesson? Am I saying that religion is a bad thing and religion is to be avoided? Well, no, of course I'm not. The problem with the Pharisees isn't that they were religious. The problem is how they viewed God. And tragically, it's the same problem with so many people in Ireland today. And Jesus does an incredible job of illustrating that in this story. Notice verse 29. The son says, "All these years I've been slaving for you." That's a significant choice of words, isn't it? I've been slaving for you. I mean, we already know what the father's like. He's gracious, he's compassionate, but this older son seems to think he's some sort of a tyrant. In fact, he's not treating the father as a father at all. He's treating him like a slave driver. Notice that verse again. All these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. You men who are fathers, you love making your children happy, don't you? You know, I've got a son, and I just love putting a smile on his face, and I don't do it for any particular reason. I just do it because I can. Because I love to see him smiling. I love to see him happy. And I know that there are some bad fathers out there, and I'm sorry if that's the case with you, but any father who is even remotely worthy of the title loves to lavish kindness on his children. But notice this son. He has completely twisted that entire concept. He doesn't understand what fatherly kindness is all about. He thinks that the love of the father is entirely dependent on following his orders. He thinks that the secret to being accepted by the father is to do. He thinks to himself, if I can just work as hard as I can, if I can be as productive as I can, then I can earn the father's love. And that, I think, explains why he's so disgusted by this party. You see, if the father is lavishing the younger son with kindness, even though he hasn't earned it, then that turns his entire worldview completely upside down. The older son, he doesn't work hard because he loves the father. He works hard because he thinks that that's the most effective route to getting what he wants. And now that he's seen that there's another way to get what he wants, now that he sees he could have got all he wants without working hard, he feels like he's been wasting his time. And he thinks to himself, well, what's the point in working my socks off if this fellow can just clear off, if he can blow everything, and then he can come back home and be welcomed with open arms. And you can imagine some of the Pharisees who were listening to this story. You can imagine whenever the penny drops, whenever they work out that Jesus is talking about them, you can imagine how angry they would have been. You can imagine the indignation rising up inside them. You can imagine their faces turning bright red because Jesus really hits a nerve. But of course that's the point. Jesus is supposed to hit a nerve. Because who is this older brother? He's not just the Pharisees. He's you. Or at least, he might be you. It's possible to be a good, decent, respectable person. It's possible even to be a religious person. It's possible to be at every single church service and yet to have completely the wrong idea about God. It's possible to see God as an employer who needs to be impressed by your timesheet rather than a father who delights in lavishing his sons with grace. And I wonder, is that what you are? Are you like this older son? And I wonder, if that's what you're like, can you see some of the ways in which religion has ruined your life? Are you resentful? Are you judgmental? Are you ungrateful? Are you frightened? Well, Jesus is giving you a warning in this passage. And so you need to listen to the warning. Now, maybe you're watching and you're not a Christian, and you know you're not a Christian. And one of the reasons you're not a Christian is you're actually quite put off by how judgmental and how bitter many Christians can be. Well, do you see from this story, that is not actually what Christianity is all about. In fact, Jesus is telling us here, many of those people who are such a turn-off when it comes to Christianity, they may well be religious, but they're not actually Christians. Because if they were Christians, then they would realise it's all about God's grace. And if they understood it was all about God's grace, then their resentment and their arrogance would completely disappear. You can't let that put you off. Or maybe this morning you get all of that, and you know that's not true Christianity, but you're still not entirely sure if the gospel is really for you. Well, there's one final and very important warning I have to make. You see, this son's understanding of what the father was like, it ruined him in many ways. The Pharisees' understanding of what God was like, it ruined them in many ways. But I haven't actually mentioned the most serious one. And this, more than anything else, is why you have to take the gospel seriously. Notice what happens in this last scene. The father throws this enormous party, and the older son refuses to go in. And it's really, really tragic, because the story doesn't end the way we expect it to. The story doesn't end with happily ever after. It ends with this enormous rift between these two characters. And I want you to notice, the rift is not because of the father. The father does everything he can. He comes out, he pleads with the son to come in, he pleads with the son to be a part of this party, but the older son will not budge. And this is very important. Why doesn't the older son go in? Verse 29. Look, All these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. This man doesn't miss out in spite of his good work. He doesn't miss out even though he has worked hard. He doesn't miss out in spite of the fact that he's decent and religious. He misses out because of his religion. His hard work, his decency, they are the very things that leave him out in the cold, because they stop him from understanding grace. So let me say to you this morning as we finish, your hard work is good, your uprightness is good, your decency is good, but if any of those things get in the way of you and grace, they are going to bring you ruin. Let me say to all of you, whether you've done this before or not, let go of what you've done. Don't bring it into the equation at all. Go to the one who shows grace. Go to the loving Father. Go to the one who didn't just give a fattened calf, but go to the one who gave the very, very best thing he had. Go to the one who has given his only begotten Son so that he could die, so you could become part of the family. And who knows, maybe some of you today, you'll do that for the very first time, and that would be a brilliant thing. And if that's what you do, well then the reaction of heaven itself is in verse 32. We had to celebrate. You were dead and are alive again. You were lost and are found.